The iron muzzle scraped against the stone floor, stained with fresh blood. The metal was warm, still holding the heat of the face it had imprisoned for 3 years. Inside the great house, Mistress Eleanor lay fallen amongst the mahogany furniture, her wide eyes staring at the ceiling painted with cherubs she herself had commissioned from Paris. Beside her, a heavy silver candelabrum still dripped, its base dented from the impact. 3, 4, 5 blows, precise, furious, necessary. Eliza did not tremble. She did not cry. She simply took a deep breath for the first time in 3 years, without feeling the metal dig into her mouth, without the internal spikes tearing her tongue with every movement. Blood trickled from the corners of her lips, mixed with accumulated saliva, with pent-up pain, with the screams she could never release. "Now you know what it is to be too beautiful," she said, her voice hoarse, broken, rough as sandpaper on old wood. 3 days earlier, the mistress had ordered the blacksmith to tighten the muzzle. The reason? A visiting nephew, down from Savannah, had looked at Eliza with interest during supper. Just a look, that was all. But to Mistress Eleanor, that was a mortal betrayal. The slave's skin on her face had been raw ever since. The wounds had begun to swell, to fester, but the mistress didn't care. On the contrary, she smiled every time she passed Eliza and saw the suffering etched in those green eyes she hated so much. The silence of the great house was now absolute. The other house slaves knew, but no one screamed, no one ran. Only the wind drifted through the open windows, carrying the scent of melted wax, French lavender, and fear. An old fear, centuries old, that had finally found its answer. Aunt Belle appeared at the door, holding a cloth bundle with clothes and food. The old cook's eyes met Eliza's. Not a word was spoken. It wasn't necessary. "Go now, child," Aunt Belle whispered. "The slave catcher won't be long." Eliza looked at the muzzle on the floor one last time. 3 years of humiliation, 3 years of pain, 3 years of being paraded like a circus animal for guests at the great house, while the wealthy ladies laughed and remarked on the negress too pretty for her own good. She picked up the muzzle, felt the weight of the metal in her hand, and threw it onto the mistress's body. "Keep it for the next life," she said, spitting blood onto the Georgian marble floor. Outside, the night was pitch black. New moon, the best night to disappear. Eliza descended the stairs of the great house for the last time, her bare feet treading the same path they had for years, but now with a different weight in her chest. It wasn't guilt. It was freedom. Freedom soaked in blood, built on vengeance, but freedom all the same. In the slave quarters, some women watched through the cracks in the cabin doors. None spoke, but they all saw, and they all understood. Eliza crossed the yard toward the dense woods, carrying only the bundle and the certainty that she would never again be anyone's property. Behind her, the great house began to stir with the first screams of horror, but she was no longer there to hear them. The year was 1847, Mississippi Delta. Oak Hill Plantation was one of the largest producers of cotton in the region, with nearly 200 enslaved people working from before dawn until nightfall. Cotton was green gold in those days. Each bale was worth a fortune in the ports of Liverpool, and Master Wallace Vance knew this better than anyone. His plantations stretched for miles, with cotton fields that seemed endless, overcrowded slave cabins, and a great house that mimicked the mansions of the English gentry. Eliza was 19 when she was purchased by the master. She had been born on the plantation itself, daughter of Abigail, an African woman brought from the Gold Coast, and of a white overseer named Phineas, who had abused her mother for years until he died of yellow fever. From this cursed union Eliza was born, with features that fit nowhere: light brown skin, kinky but loose hair, and light green eyes like river water in the spring. Eyes that seemed like colored glass in the Sunday eyes that shone too brightly. "This child has the eyes of folk, not of beast," said the midwife when Eliza was born, whispering, "Lord have mercy." Abigail died when Eliza was only 12. Died of exhaustion in the fields, her body simply giving up under the scalding Sunday. Eliza was left alone, raised by the other women in the quarters, learning to survive, to cook, to sew, to care for children. She was skilled with her hands. Aunt Belle, the oldest cook on the plantation, taught her everything. "You're too beautiful," child Aunt Belle warned one day while teaching Eliza to make peach preserves. "And beauty in the quarters is a curse, not a blessing. Hide that gaze, lower that head, pretend you're invisible. But there was no being invisible with those eyes. At 15, Eliza was called to work in the great house. The former handmaiden had run off, and Mistress Eleanor needed someone new, someone young, strong, who could sew and serve well. Eliza was chosen. At first, it seemed like a blessing. Working in the great house meant not burning in the sun, not carrying heavy loads, eating better scraps. But Eliza soon discovered there were prisons worse than the whipping post. Mistress Eleanor Vance was 35 years old with a heart made of stone and bile. She was the daughter of declining tobacco barons from Virginia, married at 14 to Master Wallace in a family arrangement. She did not love her husband. He did not love her. But they both loved power, money, status. The mistress was known throughout the region as the Delta Viper. Her punishments were legendary. She would have the teeth of slave girls who smiled too much pulled out. She burned the soles of the feet of those who tried to escape. She tied pregnant women to posts in the sun just to see how long they could endure. Respect is earned through fear, she would tell her friends during afternoon tea. Negroes need to know who's in charge. The other ladies would laugh, approve, and exchange recipes for punishments, as if they were exchanging recipes for cakes. That's how it worked. Cruelty as a social status. The more cruel, the more respected. Beside the mistress, Master Wallace was a drunken ghost. He drank bourbon from noon onward, concerned only with cotton profits and horse races. Fat, sweaty, always with his shirt open and his beard untrimmed, he ignored the screams coming from the quarters. He ignored his wife's punishments. He ignored everything, as long as the money kept coming in. The wife runs the house. I run the fields, he would say, belching. But the worst of them all was Caleb, their eldest son. At 23, Caleb was called Cruel Hands by the enslaved. He had a habit of showing up in the quarters at night, picking out some young girl and dragging her to the barn. No one could do anything. The mistress knew, the master knew, everyone knew, and no one did anything. One night, Caleb tried to take Eliza. She was 16 and was returning from the great house with a basket of laundry. He appeared in the darkness, smelling of wine and sweat. "Come here, my little green-eyed gal," he said, his voice slurred. Eliza dropped the basket and ran. She ran to the quarters, locking herself in with the other women. Caleb pounded on the door, shouted, threatened. But he didn't come in. Aunt Belle had blocked the door with her body. "She's a house girl now, sir," Aunt Belle said firmly. "The mistress won't like it if you spoil her new handmaiden." Caleb spat on the ground and left. But Eliza knew it wasn't over. It was just a pause. The next morning, as Eliza was helping the mistress dress, her mistress looked at her in the mirror. "Did my son try to take you yesterday?" the mistress asked, applying rouge to her lips. Eliza swallowed hard. "Yes, and you ran?" "I ran. Mistress." The mistress turned, looked Eliza up and down, and smiled. A cold smile. "Good girl. Keep it that way. You're my handmaiden now, not Caleb's plaything. But don't think that makes you special. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Excellent. Now go fetch my lace shawl, the French one." Eliza obeyed. She always obeyed. She had no choice. But something inside her began to twist that day. A small anger, the size of a seed, an anger that would yet grow. The days in the great house followed a cruel and monotonous routine. Eliza woke before the sun, helped the mistress dress, tidied the rooms, served breakfast, embroidered, sewed, cared for the children, served lunch, cleaned, served supper, waited until the mistress slept. Only then could she return to her cabin. 14, 15 hours of work every day. No days off, no rest, no life. But the work wasn't the worst part. It was the looks. Every visitor who came to the plantation looked at Eliza, and every look was a new danger. A cotton merchant from New Orleans commented during supper, "That's a fine-looking handmaiden you have, Master Vance. Eyes like emeralds." The mistress dropped her fork with a clatter. "She's just a slave," she said, her tone clipped. But Eliza saw it, saw the hatred in her mistress's eyes, saw the jealousy, saw the venom. A visiting preacher blessed Eliza on the forehead and said, "May God protect this creature of dangerous beauty." A neighboring planter offered $1,000 more for her. "She's not for sale," the master replied. "Drunk. My wife is fond of her." And every comment, every look, every word about Eliza's beauty was another nail in her coffin. The mistress did not forget. She did not forgive. She was just waiting for the right moment. For 2 years, Eliza served in silence. She learned to walk hunched over, to hide her face, to avert her eyes. But it was no use. Her beauty could not be hidden, and the mistress did not rest. One afternoon, the mistress's youngest daughter, Clara, just 6 years old, was playing in the parlor while Eliza embroidered. "Eliza, why are your eyes different?" the girl asked, curious. "I don't know, little miss. They're pretty. They look like the sky when it rains." The mistress, who was pretending to read a French book, looked up. "Clara, come here," she called. The girl obeyed. "Listen to me, my child," the mistress said, holding the child's face firmly. "Beauty in a Negro is not beauty. It is the devil's snare. You do not praise such things. Do you understand?" Clara's eyes widened and she nodded. "Yes, Mama." Eliza kept embroidering, her head down, but her hands were trembling. At that moment, she knew her time was running out. The anger inside her, which had been the size of a seed, was now the size of a stone. And stones can break windows. It was on an August night, when the cold cut through the Mississippi Delta like a sharp knife, that everything changed. There were visitors at the plantation. Julian, the mistress's nephew from Savannah, a young man of 20-something with aspirations of studying law in Boston. It was a formal dinner. The great house was lit with French candles, the table set with English porcelain, the slaves all in uniform. Eliza was serving the port wine, moving silently among the guests. She had learned the art of being invisible, eyes down, light steps, breath held. But as she passed beside Julian with the bottle, the young man looked up and froze, his fork suspended in mid-air. "My God," he murmured, too low for the others to hear, but loud enough for Eliza to feel the danger. She continued serving, pretending not to have heard. But it was too late. The mistress had seen. Those snake eyes missed nothing. She kept talking, smiling, playing the perfect hostess. But Eliza knew that smile. It was the smile that came before the storm. The dinner ended. The guests moved to the music room. Eliza began to clear the plates when she felt the mistress's hand grab her arm with force. "You did it on purpose," the mistress hissed, her nails digging into Eliza's skin. "No, mistress. I was just serving." "Liar!" The slap came fast, cracking across Eliza's face. "You sway your hips, you provoke, you cast those devil eyes upon the men." "I did nothing, mistress. I swear to God." Another slap, harder. "Do not use God's name, you filthy mouth." The mistress was purple with rage. "Do you think you are a person? Do you think you can seduce whomever you please?" The master appeared at the door, staggering. "What is this noise, woman?" "Nothing that concerns you," the mistress screamed. "Go back to your bourbon." The master shrugged and left. Eliza was trembling now, knowing something terrible was coming. The mistress pushed her into the hallway. "Tomorrow you will learn a lesson you will never forget," she said, her voice low and venomous. "You will learn what happens to a negress who forgets her place." That night, Eliza could not sleep. Lying in the cabin, among the other women snoring from exhaustion, she stared at the thatch roof and felt fear tighten its grip on her chest. Aunt Belle, on the pallet beside her, held her hand in the dark. "Be strong, child," the old woman whispered. "Storms pass. They always pass." But this storm was not going to pass. The next morning, just after breakfast, the mistress sent for the plantation blacksmith. Silas was a huge man, a former slave who had bought his own freedom and now made a living making horseshoes, gates, and instruments of torture for the plantations in the region. He arrived, sweating, carrying a bag of tools and something wrapped in cloth. "Brought what the mistress asked for," he said, not looking at anyone. The mistress smiled. "Excellent. Bring Eliza here." 2 overseers dragged Eliza from the kitchen to the yard. She tried to resist, but it was useless. The other slaves stopped working, watching from a distance, terrified. Aunt Belle covered her mouth with her hands. "Kneel," the mistress ordered. Eliza knelt on the packed earth, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. Silas unwrapped the bundle and revealed an iron muzzle. It was a horrible piece of rusted metal, once used to prevent slaves from eating sugarcane or talking during work. It was shaped like a horse's bridle, with internal spikes and a lock at the nape of the neck. Eliza's eyes widened. "No, mistress, please." "Shut your mouth," the mistress shouted. You will wear this until I decide you can take it off. You will wear it while you work, while you sleep, while you breathe. You will learn that beauty without my permission is a crime. But I did nothing. Your existence is doing too much. Silas approached, avoiding looking into Eliza's eyes. He knew what this meant. He knew the suffering that was to come. But he needed the money. He needed to survive. So he placed the muzzle on Eliza's face as the overseers held her arms. The metal was cold. The internal spikes pierced her mouth as soon as the muzzle was fitted. Eliza screamed, but the sound came out muffled, distorted. Silas began to solder the lock at the nape of her neck. The smell of burning metal mixed with the smell of burning flesh. Eliza tried to struggle, but the overseers held her fast. "This will make you more obedient," the mistress said, watching everything with satisfaction. "And uglier too." 2 lessons at once. When Silas finished, Eliza fell forward, her hands trying to tear the muzzle off, but it was soldered shut, trapped. It wouldn't come off. The internal spikes tore her tongue, her cheeks, her lips. She couldn't close her mouth properly. Saliva dribbled out. Her breathing came in short, desperate gasps. "Get up," the mistress ordered, "and get back to work." Eliza tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't obey. Aunt Belle ran to her and helped her up. "Come on, child," she whispered. "Let's go slowly." The other slaves returned to work in silence. But they had all seen. They would all remember. This wasn't just a punishment. It was a warning. For the next 3 years, Eliza lived in hell. The muzzle never came off. She ate liquid mush that Aunt Belle prepared, trying to slip small spoonfuls through the gaps in the metal. Most of the food fell out. Eliza grew thin until she was a shadow of herself. The skin on her face began to get infected where the metal touched it. Pus oozed from the wounds. The smell was unbearable, but the mistress didn't care. On the contrary, she paraded Eliza for visitors. "Want to see what I do with a slave who thinks she's beautiful?" she would say, laughing. The other ladies would look on, horrified but also fascinated. Some took out perfumed handkerchiefs to cover their noses. Others made comments. "How efficient, Eleanor. I shall have one made. Truly, beauty in a Negro is a problem indeed." Eliza stood there, in the parlor, being discussed like an object, like a misbehaving pet. Her green eyes, which once shone, were now sunken, surrounded by dark circles. But they still watched. They still saw everything. They still stored every humiliation like fuel. One evening, 3 years into wearing the muzzle, the mistress was having supper with her husband and decided to call for Eliza. "Come here, my pretty one," she said with cruel irony. Eliza approached, shuffling her feet. "Do you know what I found out today?" the mistress continued, savoring her wine. "My nephew Julian, the one who looked at you that night, married a beautiful girl from a fine Virginian family, a baron's daughter, an enormous fortune." She paused, looking at Eliza. "And do you know what else? He doesn't even remember you. When I mentioned your name, he didn't know who I was talking about." The mistress laughed. "So tell me, was it worth it? All this suffering for a look that meant nothing?" Eliza did not answer. She couldn't. But her eyes spoke. And what they said made the mistress stop laughing for a second. "You may go," she said, unsettled. Eliza returned to the kitchen. Aunt Belle was there, preparing the mistress's nightly tea. "I heard everything the old woman said," not looking at Eliza, "and I know what you're thinking." Eliza moved closer. Aunt Belle continued stirring the herbs in the pot. "I lost a daughter too," Aunt Belle said, her voice low. "Sold away when she was 12. Never saw her again. I died inside that day. But I stayed alive on the outside. Do you know why?" Eliza shook her head. "Because I knew that one day I'd have a chance to return the pain, and that day has come." Aunt Belle opened her hand. In her palm were some dried leaves. "Belladonna," she whispered, "angel's trumpet. It doesn't kill right away. It makes a person dizzy, confused, weak, but awake enough to feel everything." Eliza's green eyes shone for the first time in 3 years. "You want freedom?" Aunt Belle asked. Eliza nodded. "Then tonight you will have it, but it will cost blood. Are you ready?" Eliza nodded again, more forcefully. Aunt Belle dropped the belladonna leaves into the mistress's tea. The moon was new that night. The sky, black as pitch, not even the stars were out, as if they knew it was better not to witness what was to come. In the great house, the candles flickered in the wind, that came through the windows. Mistress Eleanor was in her room, wearing the French linen nightgown she was so fond of. The master was already drunk in his office, as always. Caleb had gone to town to spend money on prostitutes and gambling. The house was almost empty. Aunt Belle went up with the tea tray, her hands steady despite her age. 73 years of carrying pain, humiliation, slave labor. 73 years waiting for the right moment, and that moment had arrived. "You took your time," the mistress complained, sitting at her vanity, brushing her long hair. "This tea should have been here 10 minutes ago." "Forgive me, mistress," was making sure it was hot enough. "Leave it there and get out. I want silence." Aunt Belle placed the tray on the small table beside the bed and left, closing the door softly. In the hallway, Eliza was hidden in the shadows, waiting. The two women exchanged a look. Nothing needed to be said. Everything had already been arranged. Eliza had spent the last few weeks observing everything. The routine of the great house was like a clock, predictable, methodical, perfectly synchronized. The mistress drank her tea every night at 10. Then, she would read a little, say her prayers, and sleep. The master never entered his wife's room. They had slept separately for years. The house servants were dismissed after supper, except for Aunt Belle, who always stayed until the mistress was asleep. But tonight would be different. Eliza waited for 15 minutes. 15 minutes that felt like 15 hours. She stood in the dark corridor, listening to her own heartbeat, feeling the weight of the muzzle on her face, feeling the pain of 3 years of humiliation burn like a live coal in her chest. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, from anticipation. Inside the room, the mistress took the first sip of tea. It was bitter, more bitter than usual. "What rubbish," she muttered, but took another sip anyway. She was thirsty. The third sip came, then the fourth. The belladonna slowly began to take effect. First, a slight dizziness. Then, her vision blurred. Her hands began to tremble. The mistress tried to get up from the bed, but her legs wouldn't respond properly. "What? What is happening?" she whispered to the empty room. That's when the door opened. Eliza entered slowly, closing the door behind her. The candlelight made shadows dance on the walls. The mistress tried to focus her eyes, but everything was spinning. "You," she managed to say, her tongue heavy. "What? What did you do?" Eliza did not answer. She just approached, step by step. The iron muzzle was still fastened to her face, but in her hands, she held the tools Silas used, a small lever, pliers, and an iron wrench. She had stolen them from the blacksmith's workshop 3 days before, hidden under her pallet in the cabin. Don't you dare," the mistress tried to scream, but her voice came out weak, almost a whisper. Eliza stopped beside the bed. Her green, sunken, tired eyes met the mistress's, and for the first time in 3 years, it was the mistress who felt fear. "You were born to serve me," Negress the mistress managed to say, even with her tongue tied. You are property. My property." Eliza tilted her head, the metal of the muzzle creaking. She placed the tools on the bed and picked up the silver candelabrum from the bedside table. It was heavy, solid, a wedding gift to the mistress, straight from England. She always spoke of it with pride, showing it to guests, boasting of its value. "Property," Eliza repeated, her voice muffled and distorted by the muzzle. "You made me property. You made me an animal. You made me nothing." She raised the candelabrum. "Now I will make you an example." The mistress tried to raise her arms to defend herself, but her body would not obey. The belladonna had taken over. She could only watch, terrified, as the candelabrum came down. The first blow struck her shoulder. The mistress screamed, but the sound was weak. The second blow struck her chest. The third, her head. The fourth, the fifth. Eliza did not stop. 3 years of pain came out in every movement. 3 years of humiliation. 3 years in a muzzle. 3 years of not being human. When she finally stopped, Eliza was panting. The candelabrum was smeared with blood. The mistress lay fallen among the feather pillows, her wide eyes staring at the ceiling painted with cherubs. The same cherubs she looked at every night before sleeping. The same cherubs that never saved her from herself. Eliza dropped the candelabrum beside the body. Her hands were shaking now, not from fear, from relief. A relief so great it felt like anesthesia. She knelt on the floor, picked up the tools, and began to work on the muzzle. It was difficult. The solder was well done. Silas had done a thorough job, but Eliza had time. She had watched the blacksmith work for months. She knew where to apply pressure. She knew where to break it. The lever went into the side of the muzzle. She pushed. The metal groaned, pushed harder. A crack appeared. A little more. Sweat ran down her face, stinging the open wounds. "Come off, come off, come off," she repeated through clenched teeth. The muzzle began to give way. First one side, then the other. Eliza used the pliers to pull out the internal spikes one by one. Each spike that came out was a small liberation. Every movement was a tiny victory. Blood ran from her mouth, mixed with pus from the old wounds, but she didn't stop. Finally, after what seemed like hours but were only minutes, the muzzle came loose. Eliza tore it from her face with both hands and threw it to the floor with force. The metal hit the wooden planks with a hollow, empty sound. 3 years of prison were now just scrap iron on the floor. Eliza touched her own face. The skin was raw, the wounds burned, her mouth bled. But it was free, free. She opened her mouth for the first time in 3 years without feeling metal piercing her tongue. She took a deep breath without the weight of iron compressing her face, and she cried. She cried in silence, the tears running down her wounds, burning like fire, but relieving like rain after a drought. She cried for the 3 lost years. She cried for her dead mother. She cried for all the women in the quarters who would never have this chance. But she did not cry for long. There was no time for grief. She had to get out of there. Eliza picked up the muzzle from the floor one last time. She looked at the metal stained with blood, stained with suffering. Then she looked at the mistress's body on the bed, and she placed the muzzle on the dead woman's chest. "Keep it for the next life," she said, spitting blood onto the Georgian marble floor. "Maybe you'll learn what it's like to wear it." Aunt Belle entered the room at that moment, carrying a cloth bundle. "Here," she said, handing it to Eliza. "Food, clean clothes, a little money I've stolen from the pantry over the years. It'll be enough for a start." "You're not coming?" Eliza asked, her voice still hoarse. "No, I'm too old to run. But you're young. You have a life ahead of you. Go to the maroon settlement in the Great Briar Thicket. It's 3 leagues from here, following the river up. Ask for Brother Amos. Tell him Belle sent you. He'll take you in. And if they catch you," Aunt Belle smiled, a tired smile of someone who has lived too long, "then I'll die happy knowing I helped you be free. That's worth any punishment." The 2 women embraced. It wasn't a long hug. There wasn't time. But it was a hug that said everything words never could. "Go," Aunt Belle ordered, "and don't look back." Eliza nodded. She took the bundle, gave one last look at the room, at the mistress's body, at the muzzle on her chest, at the rich walls, the expensive furniture, at everything that represented years of oppression, and left. The hallway was dark and silent. Eliza descended the stairs of the great house for the last time. Her bare feet took the same path they had for years, but now every step was different. Every step was her own. Not the mistress's, not the master's, hers. In the parlor, she passed the family portrait hanging on the wall. The fat, drunken master, the mistress with her false smile, Caleb with his cruel air of superiority, and there in the corner, almost out of the frame, was Eliza holding a tray, out of focus, her face undefined. Just a shadow. A piece of property, an object. She spat on the portrait. "I am no longer yours." She crossed the dining room, where she had served hundreds of meals. She passed through the kitchen, where Aunt Belle still was, cleaning the teacups as if nothing had happened. The 2 exchanged one last look. Nothing more needed to be said. Eliza opened the back door and stepped out into the night. The yard was empty. The slave quarters, silent. Some people who were awake watched through the cracks in the doors, but no one spoke. They all knew, and they all approved. As Eliza passed in front of the cabins, a low voice came from the darkness. "Go with God, sister." Another voice joined in, "And with all the saints." And another, "And with the strength of the ancestors." Eliza didn't stop to answer. She just nodded her head and kept walking. She crossed the yard, past the barn where Caleb abused the girls, past the blacksmith's workshop, past the cotton fields that swallowed lives every day, and finally, she reached the edge of the woods. There it was, the line between slavery and freedom, between death and life, between the past and the future. Eliza looked back one last time. The great house was lit, imposing, silent. It looked like a white tomb in the middle of the darkness. And then she entered the woods. The trees swallowed her. The darkness embraced her. And Eliza vanished into the night like smoke. The scream that woke Oak Hill Plantation came with the first ray of sunlight. It was Delia, the handmaiden who replaced Eliza in the mornings, who found the mistress's body. The sound she made didn't seem human. It was a howl of pure terror that shot through the great house, the yard, and reached the slave quarters. In seconds, the whole plantation was awake. Master Wallace stumbled up the stairs, still drunk from the night before, his shirt open, his eyes swollen. When he entered the room and saw his wife, the blood on the walls, the fallen candelabrum, and the iron muzzle on her chest, his legs gave way. He leaned against the doorframe, his mouth open, unable to form words. Eleanor was all he could manage, his voice thin and broken. Caleb arrived an hour later, returning from town with a hangover and the smell of cheap perfume. When they told him what had happened, he turned pale, not with sadness, with fear, because if a slave could do that to his mother, it meant he wasn't safe either. "Where is Eliza?" he asked, his voice trembling. No one knew, or rather, everyone knew, but no one would say. The entire slave quarters had suddenly gone mute. The master had 3 men whipped, trying to get information. None of them spoke. He had Aunt Belle tied to the whipping post. She endured it in silence, her old body bleeding under the sun, but she did not open her mouth. She ran, was all Aunt Belle said, spitting blood. "And you'll never find her." The master sent for the most famous slave catcher in the region, Jedediah Pike, known as the Tracker. He was a brutal man, the son of a slave and an overseer, who hunted runaways with cruel efficiency. He arrived with his men and his dogs the next day, studied the scene, examined the room, talked to the slaves. "Was it just one?" he asked, incredulous. It was the master, confirmed. Jedediah shook his head. "Then this negress has more courage than most men, but I'll find her. I always do." The dogs picked up Eliza's trail, leaving the great house, crossing the yard, and entering the woods. Jedediah and his men followed for 3 days. They went up the river, searched trails, burned abandoned camps, but they found nothing. It was as if Eliza had become a ghost. On the 4th day, the dogs returned alone, wounded, with arrows stuck in their backs. Jedediah understood the message. She had reached the Maroon settlement, and you didn't invade a settlement easily. He returned to Oak Hill Plantation empty-handed. "There's nothing more I can do," he told the master. "She's protected now." The master turned white with rage. "I'll pay you double. It's not about money. It's about not dying, trying. The settlement in the Great Briar Thicket has over 300 armed men. I'm not a fool." Jedediah left, and with him went the master's last hope for revenge. He locked the room where the mistress had died and never entered it again. He ordered prayers, said. He ordered investigations. He offered rewards. But Eliza was never found. Aunt Belle died 2 weeks after the whippings. She died free on the inside, even with her body broken. On the night of her burial, all the women in the slave quarters softly sang a song of freedom, and they say the wind carried that song all the way to the Great Briar Thicket, where Eliza was starting a new life. In the settlement, Eliza was welcomed as a hero. Brother Amos, a huge man who had escaped from a salt mine in Virginia 15 years earlier, looked at her wounded face, at the marks of the muzzle still bleeding, and said only, "Welcome home." Home. That word sounded strange to Eliza's ears. She had never had a home, only prisons with pretty names. But there, surrounded by free men and women, working their own land, eating their own food, sleeping without fear of waking up as someone's property, she began to understand the true meaning of that word. The wounds on her face took months to heal. They left deep marks, scars she would carry forever. The green eyes were still beautiful, but now they were surrounded by dead flesh, by twisted skin, by permanent reminders of the price of freedom. "It looks horrible," Eliza said one day, looking at her reflection in the river water. An older woman named Patience, who had lost an ear in a punishment, replied, "It looks free, and free is always beautiful." Eliza learned to plant, to harvest, to cook for herself. She learned to use a machete, to defend herself, to walk in the woods without making a sound. She learned that there was life beyond the slave quarters, real life, with choices, with mistakes, with successes, but with dignity. A year after her escape, she was by the river washing clothes when she heard new voices. They were 3 young girls, recent arrivals, who had fled from a neighboring plantation. One of them was only 14 and was terrified, trembling, hugging her own legs. Eliza approached, kneeling beside her. "What's your name?" she asked. "Martha," the girl answered softly. "They call me Martha." Eliza felt her chest tighten. It was a strong name, like the name of the old cook who had saved her life. "That's a beautiful name," she said, "and a strong one. You're safe now." The girl looked at Eliza's scarred face and asked, "What did they do to you?" "They made me an example of what not to do, but I turned it into a reason to live." In the following years, Eliza's story spread through the plantations of the Mississippi Delta like wildfire. Every slave quarters told a different version. Some said she had killed the mistress with her bare hands. Others said she had used dark magic. Still others said she had returned as a vengeful spirit to haunt the great house. The truth is, no one knew for sure what had happened that night. They only knew that Mistress Eleanor, the Delta Viper, had died a violent death, and that Eliza, the green-eyed slave, had vanished like a ghost. And that story was enough. The mistresses of the region began to be afraid. Some ordered the iron muzzles removed from their slaves. Others began to lock their bedroom doors at night. Still others began to taste their own food before eating for fear of poison. Fear had changed sides. At Oak Hill Plantation, things fell apart quickly. Master Wallace began to drink even more, spending fortunes on bourbon and prostitutes. Caleb fled to Boston, afraid he would be next. The enslaved began to escape in groups, knowing there was a nearby settlement where they would be welcomed. In 2 years, the plantation had lost half its workforce. In 1850, 3 years after the mistress's death, the master was found dead in his office. Officially, it was a heart attack. But the slaves who were still there whispered another story, that he had seen a woman with green eyes in the window before he died, and that the shock had stopped his heart. Truth or legend, no one could say. Oak Hill Plantation was sold at auction. The great house was looted. The furniture, sold. The cotton fields, abandoned. In 5 years, it was in ruins. The walls began to crack, the roof collapsed, and weeds took over. And they say that to this day, on nights of the new moon, you can hear the sound of a metal muzzle being dragged across the floor. Eliza lived in the settlement until 1876, when old age finally took her. She was 48 years old, but she looked 80. The hard life in the settlement, the scars, the diseases, all took their toll. But she died free. She died surrounded by people who loved her. She died with her own name on her lips, not the name a master had given her. On the day of her funeral, more than 200 people showed up. They came from neighboring settlements, from nearby plantations, from distant towns. They all wanted to honor the woman who had taken off the muzzle and shown that it was possible to fight back, that it was possible to have vengeance, that it was possible to be free. Patience, who was now the oldest in the settlement, spoke at the funeral. Eliza taught us that beauty is not a curse, slavery is, and that the only way to break a curse is with courage. They buried Eliza near the river, under a large magnolia tree that bloomed every year, and they say that since that day, the river sings differently. It sings a song of freedom, of just vengeance, of pain transformed into struggle. In the slave quarters, Eliza's name became a legend. Mothers told their daughters, grandmothers told their granddaughters, the woman with green eyes who tore off the muzzle and silenced the viper forever. The woman who proved that even the most broken, oppressed person can still rise up one last time, and that this one last time can change everything. Since that August night in 1847, no mistress in the Mississippi Delta ever slept completely peacefully, because they all knew that somewhere, in some slave quarters, in some dark corner, there was an Eliza waiting for the right moment, waiting for the chance, waiting to take off the muzzle and show that behind the iron, there had always been a woman with a name, a woman with a soul, a woman who would not die in silence.